Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue dans l'épisode 8 d'Original Artefacts. Avec 3 artistes légendaires de ces comics, Williamson, Bernard Krigstein, et Harvey Kurtzman. Et maintenant scénariste et éditeur de The Comic Interprétaire, voici Satan Nico.
Merci Isabel. Hey, Satanico here once again for God Loves Comics, and this is Original Artefacts Episode 8. So let's get to it. First up, we have the great Al Williamson, one of my personal favorite comics artists of all time. And this is an exquisite page of original art that is instantly recognizable from Return of the Jedi and one of its funnier scenes. I think because Star Wars imagery is so culturally embedded into our brain stems at this point, that it's easy to look at this page and admire Al Williamson's and Carlos Garzon's great facility without being appropriately blown away by it. After all, this page adheres closely to the film version. There is no explosive action scene, no new creations or impressive invention on the page. However, the amount of craft and artistry that Williamson is able to imbue into every panel, indeed nearly every line, is nothing short of jaw-dropping, even if the initial temptation is to take such a page for granted, flipping on to the next assuredly beautiful page. First, look at the facility with the multiple surfaces and textures Williamson, ably assisted by Garzon, masters. Obviously with C-3PO, it is the shimmering metal surface which the artist communicates with amorphous streams and puddles of ink that suggest shadows cast on a metallic surface. However, Williamson never succumbs to the Iron Man trope of the twinkly, shiny starburst on the armor. Williamson then has to differentiate between 3PO's surface and that of the knotty wooden throne that the Ewoks have seated him on. The wood is given a few thin, disheveled lines, as Williamson was surely aware of the old saying, "There are no straight lines in nature." Now looking at panel 4, there are yet more surfaces to delineate. Another prominent android, R2-D2, is far less shiny than its bipedal droid compatriot and is basically a rolling trash can with a series of simple geometric patterns. But next to R2 is a much more organic Ewok and yet 2 more textures. One obviously on the Ewok's fur, which Williamson does flawlessly with a deceptively simple looking series of thin wavy brushstrokes. But then he must also make clear the Ewok's helm is made of bone. I think this is accomplished less as a result of Williamson's lines than the simple addition of tusk and teeth, which makes the reader easily process it as an animal skull. Although given there are no bones and ears, maybe the helm has only been partially cured as an Ewok-style choice. More surfaces are needed for the next panel, with a distant establishing shot indicating a scene change of the Ewoks' canopy village of tiki huts atop the moon of Endor's equivalents to California's giant redwoods. But Williamson, or perhaps he leaves it to Garzon, does this sparingly as a Jesse Marsh drawing with just the simplest of curved lines for the thatched roofs and the same weight of lines down the body of the trees, although using a bit of dry brush for shadow at the base of their platforms. Finally, we get to the last panel, which is the showcase panel on the page, although it is nothing more than a close-up of Luke and Leia as Luke offers a bit of cryptic dialogue. But as close-ups go, a Williamson face is as much of a showstopper as an action splash from lesser artists. Even if taken from photo refs, Williamson draws Carrie Fisher's Leia as so stunningly beautiful, even the film's cinematography could not hope to match Williamson's own brushstrokes. Every line is flawless, from Leia's delicate lashes to her slightly furrowed but subtly so brow to the intricate braiding of her hair, yet another surface Williamson masters. Similarly, Williamson's Luke in the immediate foreground looks exactly like Mark Hamill, but somehow handsomer. His jawline is a little sharper, his nose a bit finer, and Williamson also perfectly captures Luke's perpetual 1,000-yard stare as he's always looking off into the distance at some future vision only inside his own head. Finally, there is the perfect use of zipatone here to indicate a soft shadow across Luke's profile. Williamson, or Garzon, to Al's specifications, places the tone just short of the bridge of Luke's nose and the cleft of his chin to indicate the light source emanating from the left. A splash of whiteout on the zip sheet indicates light on Luke's fine Midwestern cheekbones. And finally, if you're looking for the most subtle indicator of Williamson's artistry, there is the faintest overlapping of zip texture just at the base of Luke's neck as an indicator of the shadow cast by the collar of his tunic. It is surely the most easily overlooked but subconsciously digested element on the entire page. No average artist would ever think to add this fine touch, especially on a massive franchise comic with stringent deadlines. But then Al Williamson was incapable of ever being average. And next up, we have a page from Bernie Kriegstein. For all the hand-wringing consternation about EC's fatal capitulation to the Comics Code, it's nothing less than ironic that Bernie Kriegstein in particular seemed to thrive in the short-lived New Direction EC books of the post-Kefauver environment. Kriegstein was never considered much of a horror guy at EC anyway, although a look at any number of his Atlas comic horror stories may suggest otherwise. However, in EC's New Direction under the Comics Code, Kriegstein was given his first and I believe only cover assignments on 2 issues of Piracy, and of course illustrated one of the greatest stories in the history of the medium, Master Race and Impact #1, although the cover was done by Jack Davis. Even in Aces High, which due to its focus on World War I aerial dogfights, seemed like a title created solely for George Evans' skills and famous predilection for flying machines, Kriegstein excelled on the story Spads Were Trump, perhaps the last good thing to ever have that foul name in its title. And speaking of flying machines, that was another Kriegstein masterpiece adapted from a Ray Bradbury story by Al Feldstein, which appeared in Weird Science Fantasy 23. I have both the original issue and access to all 6 pages of the original art, so look for a special Kriegstein edition of original Artefacts in the future. Every element on a Kriegstein page was treated as an important aspect of the overall design. Thus, the story title immediately stands out, with Kriegstein just doing hollow lettering and then giving it added weight and texture with some frenetic and unfussy cross-hatching at the tail of each font. It's as if Charles Schultz's Pigpen character were lurking just below and sullying the lettering with his ever-present aura of dust and grime. Spads Were Trump is such an exotic slang from World War I that few people aside from military historians would likely know what a spad actually was. I certainly didn't. In truth, the word could mean many things, including a special political advisor, or interestingly enough, an acronym for Signal Passed at Danger, meaning a train that is run through a stop signal, which must have occurred often enough that it warranted its own acronym. But in this context, SPAD stands for the French aircraft company Société pour l'Aviation et ses Dérivés. SPAD. Essentially the Society of Aviation. As it was, the SPAD 13 biplane was one of the most effective fighters of World War I. It had a top speed of 135 miles per hour, which was 10 miles per hour faster than German fighters of the same era, and was the primary fighter used by the U.S. Army Air Service. After the title, in comes the classic but often scorned Leroy lettering, which presents the Carl Wessler script in an eminently readable and utilitarian font. I was a green kid that day in April 18. Green in more ways than one. It was my first combat dogfight, and before I knew it, there was this Falls D3 on my back. I couldn't shake him. I tried every stunt in the book, and a few more I made up in the panic of the moment. But that Heine hung on and kept pumping Spandau steel at me. So I tried prayers, and Lieutenant Walt Mueller answered them. He came down on the falls from out of the sun, and old Fritz never knew what hit him. As a Kriegstein page, and in fact an entire story goes, this is very straightforward, with none of the formal experiments in storytelling seen in Master Race, nor the rebellious panel overload Kriegstein sometimes attempted in his frustrated Atlas work. Kriegstein, often seen as the most minimalist of all the EC artists, Kurtzman included, puts on a decidedly non-minimalist clinic of brushstrokes, textures, and surfaces. The half-page opening splash is a thrilling exhibit of multiple techniques that makes you wonder why Krigstein was so often determined to cram as many panels as he could onto a single page. In the background, Krigstein serves up finely ruled lines to illustrate the German Falls D3s and the US piloted Spads with precision. He defines the texture of the pilot's leather bomber helmet with choppy horizontal brushstrokes. He then deploys a variety of finely jagged lines like one might use to indicate an old TV screen on the fritz for the pilot's goggles. Fine but much more chaotic and overlapping lines for the fur collar of his jacket, and then a mess of shambolic cross-hatching and huge brushstrokes no longer concerned with delineating the pilot's clothing. Instead, they appear as an abstract visualization of the energy and tension of a dogfight. The only intervention of something tangible in this space is the pockmarked gun sight injecting itself into the chaos. The bottom two panels serve only to advance the story in the most straightforward manner possible, and Kriegstein's figure work, never really a strong suit, is a bit deflating. Kriegstein's articulation of the clothing and uniforms is more successful than his faces here. The young pilot's right hand in panel 2 is drawn rather clumsily when unstrapping his helmet, and in the third panel, his mouth and facial structure make him look more marionette than human. Also, the hero of the story, an ace pilot named Walt, is drawn with such a heavy brow and expressionless face, he would fit nicely into one of EC's dying horror books as a zombie. And a final blow, which is not Krigstein's fault, is the last word of dialogue on the page. Skake, S-K-A-K-E, is surely a typo and was intended to read shake. As EC's fortunes were rapidly declining under the newly installed code, perhaps the editorial standards were as well. Although a typo here and there should be expected from what was essentially a mom-and-pop publisher, even if Papa Gaines was ultimately responsible for the highest quality comics of the Golden Age, and Kriegstein himself for illustrating some of the most important stories in the history of the medium. I guess it's no small coincidence that a rare Harvey Kurtzman appearance in an EC science fiction title is still in service of a war story. Likely, the meticulous Kurtzman preferred a factual and well-researched milieu over an entirely fictional one, but his anti-war parable is not dissimilar in tone and concept from those in Two-Fisted Tales, albeit with considerable difference that given the genre title, Kurtzman's story actually features a mutant. An embryonic boy is affected by radiation from the 1946 atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll, and his mother dies only after taking him to the authoritarian president of the fictional nation of Argentine. You know it's fictional because Lionel Messi never played for Argentine. Or did he? El Presidente discovers that the boy is a genius and makes him his prime minister, which leads to policies that result in a great prosperity. Of course, there is no circumstance outside of Mad Magazine where Harvey Kurtzman would suggest that radiation poisoning is a good thing. So President Perez, along with his war minister and propaganda minister, turned their newfound prosperity toward military spending and an invasion that results in all three dying in the rubble aftermath of a United Nations bombing. The first thing you may notice about this page is the more organic lettering of Ben Oda when compared to the preceding Kriegstein page. Kurtzman insisted on Oda's hand lettering over the ubiquitous Leroy lettering present in most EC books. The opening horizontal panel, consuming the top third of the page, is just a triumph of brilliant composition. Just as Kurtzman stringently guided the hands of the artist on the titles he edited, here he ruthlessly directs the eyes of the reader. Nearly every bold line either races towards or curves toward the perspective vanishing point at the center of the page, albeit one blocked by a tank out of formation at the center and another just askew to the left being raised onto the massive transport ship. But after following Kurtzman's forceful directions, the eyes immediately peel off to the thick kinetic lines in the foregrounds on the left and the right. On the left stand two United Nations soldiers who Kurtzman has drawn with loose outlines and then given substance and presence with those lines. Horizontal lines on the hats, vertical lines on the tunics, and wavy diagonal lines on the trousers. There is not a moment's pause to consider these lines could indicate stripes on the most garish uniforms in history, but rather they are simply Kurtzman's unique way of shading. In fact, Kurtzman's inks over graphite look heavily influenced by Belgian woodcut artist Fran Masriel, whose work, much like Kurtzman's, was heavily political. I spoke earlier of a marionette face present in Kriegstein's story, but in panel 2 we see Kurtzman's marionette figures. Just look at the general's right leg, which Kurtzman leaves as a cylindrical construct you would only ever see in rough layouts. This is not even a background figure, but the general himself front and center of the panel, and Kurtzman has no concern about making him look as if he doesn't have a wooden leg. Panel 3 is all about composition, with Kurtzman presenting an overhead backshot of the Argenta contingent, with the focus being on the pyramid of officials walking down the hall with hats that look little different than loaves of bread or pancakes. Much like the Kriegstein page, the opening panel here is a showcase, and the remaining 6 panels are solely storytelling panels that facilitate the plot. The story, by the way, is also written by Kurtzman rather than the usual writer Al Feldstein. The final panel is something of a classic Kurtzman trope, that of the upshot of a frantic figure almost looking down directly at the reader as he pummels a surrogate of the reader or of Kurtzman himself in a character that is off panel. Kurtzman did this most effectively in the famous drowning sequence from The Corpse of Imogen in Two-Fisted Tales number 25, and it is a potent dramatic device, but one can't help but wondering if it also wasn't a perspective Kurtzman consciously replicated from growing up as a rather shrimpy, nerdy kid in New York. But even if that were the case, it only demonstrates how Kurtzman was able to personalize everyday human experience and trauma and transpose it so effectively to the inhumane killing fields of war. And that is it for episode 8 of Original Artifacts. Please take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. It would be most appreciated. I'll see you next time on God Loves Comics. Bye.
The Unrelenting.